In the spring of 1879, a small factory on the banks of the Mississippi River began producing something the world had never seen at scale before. Flour so white, so fine, so perfectly uniform that it looked almost unnatural. It wasn't magic, it wasn't alchemy, it was a steel roller. That single mechanical innovation, the steel roller mill, would quietly rewrite the way hundreds of millions of people ate, not over centuries, but over decades, and in some places, over just a few years. This is the story of how one change in the way grain was ground transformed the food supply of the modern world. How it moved from factories in Minnesota to kitchen shelves across continents, and how the body, the human body, shaped by thousands of years of eating whole grain, had to reckon with something it had never encountered before. White flour had existed for a long time before 1879, but it had always been rare, always expensive, always a symbol of privilege rather than a staple of survival. What changed in the late 19th century was scale, and scale in food history changes everything. For most of human history, bread was brown, not because people preferred it that way, but because that's what grain produced when you ground it between stones. Stone milling was ancient technology. It worked by crushing wheat kernels between two heavy rotating discs, and it crushed everything together. The bran, the germ, the endosperm. Everything became part of the flour. The result was dense, nutritious, and deeply familiar to every civilization that depended on grain. Wealthy households had long known how to sift out the darker particles, the bran, from their flour. The more you sifted, the whiter and lighter the result. White bread had been a luxury food in ancient Rome. It appeared at noble tables in medieval Europe. It was a status symbol, a way of showing that you could afford to discard the rough outer layers of the grain. But truly white flour, at a scale that could feed populations, that was impossible before industrial milling. Stone mills simply didn't have the precision to separate the components cleanly. The germ of the wheat, full of oils, would mix back in, giving flour a slightly yellowish tint and causing it to go rancid faster. So, for ordinary people, bread was whole. It had to be. And while they may have envied the white loaves of the wealthy, their bodies were quietly benefiting from every meal. The bran provided fiber. The germ provided vitamins, B1, B2, B3, iron, zinc, and more. The whole kernel was, nutritionally speaking, complete. This was the world that existed before the roller mill. A world where bread was heavy and dark, where wheat tasted like wheat, and where the grain itself carried most of its original nutrition from field to table. The steel roller mill wasn't invented overnight. It evolved through a series of experiments happening simultaneously in Europe and North America during the 1870s. The core idea was elegant. Instead of crushing grain between two flat stones, rollers pressed it in a controlled sequence. First, the outer layers were cracked away. Then, successive sets of rollers refined the interior. At each stage, different components could be sifted out. Bran here, germ there, leaving behind the starchy white endosperm that millers had always wanted most. The Minneapolis mills adopted this technology with speed and ambition. The Washburn-Crosby Company, which would later become General Mills, invested heavily in the new process. And almost immediately, the results were remarkable. The new flour was whiter, finer. It had a longer shelf life because the oily germ had been removed. It performed beautifully in baking, producing loaves that rose higher, stayed softer longer, and had a texture that consumers immediately loved. There was also a practical logic that extended beyond taste. Removing the germ meant the flour wouldn't go rancid during long transportation. In a country rapidly building out its railroad network, this was transformative. Flour milled in Minnesota could travel to New York, to New Orleans, to San Francisco, and arrive still fresh. The geography of the food supply expanded overnight. By the 1880s, roller mills were spreading across the United States, Canada, and Europe. Older stone mills couldn't compete. The economics were simply too powerful. Roller-milled white flour was cheaper to produce, easier to transport, and, crucially, it was what consumers were beginning to demand. A product that once was a luxury was becoming a commodity. And a commodity, once established, is almost impossible to dislodge. The spread of white flour followed a pattern that food historians have seen again and again. First, it was aspirational. Then it was accessible. Then it was assumed. In the 1880s and 1890s, white bread was still something many working-class families associated with occasions, Sunday meals, celebrations, company coming. Whole-grain breads remained common because they were familiar and, in rural areas, often still home-milled or locally produced. But the railroads kept pushing outward. General stores in small towns began stocking roller-milled flour in barrels and sacks. Bakeries that had operated on local grain began switching over. The price kept dropping as competition intensified and the technology spread. By the early 1900s, white flour was not a luxury in most of the industrialized world. It was the default. The advertising of the era helped cement this shift. Flour companies promoted whiteness as a sign of purity. Pillsbury's Best and Gold Medal weren't just brand names, they were promises of quality. The imagery on flour sacks showed gleaming kitchens, healthy families, golden loaves. The message was consistent and deliberate. White flour was modern. White flour was clean. White flour was progress. In contrast, whole grain products began to carry a different association. They were what poor people ate, or what people ate when they couldn't afford better. This was a remarkable inversion of the historical truth, but marketing has always been more powerful than memory. By 1910, the majority of flour consumed in the United States was refined white flour. Within another decade, the same was true across most of Western Europe. The transition that had taken thousands of years to begin took less than 40 years to complete. Entire generations grew up without ever tasting the darker, denser bread their grandparents had known. For them, white bread wasn't a luxury or a novelty. It was simply what bread was. It didn't take long for some people to notice that something had changed, not in the taste of the bread, but in the health of the populations eating it. By the early 20th century, physicians in industrial cities were observing rising rates of a peculiar condition called beriberi, a disease caused by thiamine deficiency. It had long been associated with populations in Asia who ate polished white rice. Now it was appearing among people eating refined white flour. There was also a rise in pellagra caused by niacin deficiency, and a quiet, persistent increase in constipation, digestive complaints, and what doctors of the era called intestinal sluggishness, the absence of fiber doing its slow, unrecognized work. The connection between refined grain and nutritional deficiency was not immediately obvious to most people. Bread was still bread. People were still eating. But the invisible components, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, were gone, sifted away in the milling process and often sold back as animal feed. There was a painful irony in this. The bran and germ that roller mills removed from flour, the most nutritionally dense parts of the wheat kernel, were being fed to livestock. Animals were eating the parts that the human food system had decided were waste. As nutritional science developed through the 1920s and 1930s, researchers began to understand the specific mechanisms of what was happening. Vitamins B1, B2, and B3 were identified. Their roles in human metabolism were mapped, and the connection to refined grain became undeniable. The response, when it came, was both practical and political. During World War II, the United States and Britain introduced mandatory flour enrichment, adding back thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron to replace what milling had stripped away. It was a public health intervention dressed in the language of wartime efficiency. Enrichment worked in the narrow sense that it prevented the most acute deficiency diseases. Beriberi and pellagra became rare in populations eating enriched bread. But enrichment also reinforced the dominance of white flour. It solved enough of the problem to remove urgency without restoring everything that had been lost. The fiber was still gone, the full spectrum of vitamins and minerals from the germ was still gone, and the body, still shaped by thousands of years of eating whole grain, was still adapting to an environment that had changed far faster than evolution could follow. By the mid-20th century, white flour wasn't just the dominant form of grain in the industrialized diet, it was foundational. Consider what had been built on top of it. Sliced white bread, introduced commercially in 1928, became one of the most successful food products in American history. The phrase, "the greatest thing since sliced bread," entered the language. Wonder Bread, soft, white, enriched, became a cultural icon, a symbol of post-war abundance and domestic ease. Cake mixes, pasta, pizza dough, crackers, cookies, pastry, pie crust. The convenience food revolution of the 1950s and 1960s was built almost entirely on refined white flour. Every new product assumed the same base ingredient. Every new kitchen relied on it. Children grew up eating sandwiches on white bread. School lunches were built around it. Fast food was served on it. The infrastructure of food production, the recipes, the equipment, the supply chains had been optimized for a single kind of flour. This wasn't simply a matter of preference, it was a structural lock-in. Changing the flour meant changing everything that depended on it. And yet, even within this era of absolute dominance, small currents of resistance were beginning to form. Nutritionists and food reformers had been questioning white flour since at least the 1830s. Sylvester Graham, the inventor of the graham cracker, had built an entire philosophy around whole grain. The whole wheat food movement of the early 20th century had kept these ideas alive in the margins. By the 1960s and 1970s, those margins were starting to grow. Counterculture movements in the United States and Europe began to associate whole grain bread with authenticity, with a rejection of industrial food, with a return to something older and more honest. Whole wheat bread wasn't just food anymore. It was a statement. The mainstream food industry noticed. Slowly, reluctantly, whole grain options began appearing on supermarket shelves. Not to replace white flour, but to exist alongside it, catering to a growing segment of consumers who'd begun to question what they'd been eating for generations. The roller mill is still running. Right now, in mills across North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, steel rollers are spinning, separating bran from endosperm, producing the refined white flour that remains the dominant form of grain in the global food supply. But the conversation around that flour has never been more complicated. The last few decades of nutritional research have deepened our understanding of what whole grains provide, not just isolated vitamins, but complex interactions between fiber, phytochemicals, and the gut microbiome. The picture is more intricate than early researchers imagined, and the implications reach further. Meanwhile, industrial bakers have developed techniques to add the appearance of whole grain without its full substance. Coloring bread with molasses, adding small amounts of whole wheat flour to formulations that remain mostly refined. The language of health has been incorporated into marketing in ways that would have bewildered the millers of the 1880s. Sourdough has experienced a revival, partly driven by the science of fermentation and partly by a cultural longing for food that feels handmade, slow, and real. Ancient grains, einkorn, spelt, and emmer have found new audiences among people searching for something that predates the Industrial Revolution. And yet, white flour remains. In the bread aisle, in restaurant kitchens, in the homes of billions of people who never gave it a moment's thought. The transformation that began with a steel roller in 1879 is still unfolding. It reshaped what people eat, how they feel, what they believe food should be, and how industries respond to those beliefs. It altered the relationship between farming and processing, between nutrition and convenience, between tradition and progress. Every loaf tells part of this story, every bowl of pasta, every birthday cake. The flour changed everything, and everything that changed is still changing now.